and get this show on the road. And right, can I just check, please, that we do in fact have the PowerPoint slideshow on screen and people do have audio? Lisa, if you either want to use chat or otherwise, is great. Welcome, Loretta. All right, let's get started this week. We're talking about the topic of engagement, and what I might do is actually ask you, has anyone got any questions, first of all, they want to ask before we kick off engagement? Anybody got any questions? I mean, there's plenty of stuff to work through on the ebook for this week, but just really just wondering what people have in mind when they think about engagement. All right, we'll get going. Yep, fire away.
Hi, Colin. Sorry, I've just come from the design and technology lecture.
No problems. That will be ramping up quite a bit by now too.
Yes, it's due on Friday. But I think the whole unit there, everything about teaching is about engagement, isn't it?
It pretty much is, Loretta. And you know,
if we don't engage, we don't communicate.
Exactly. And I guess that's what a curriculum document is. It's a structured invitation to engage.
Yes.
And to engage around particular points within a curriculum cycle. So, and part of a teacher's capacity, part of our training is to know when, where, and how to engage.
Yes.
And these primary connections units, they're a little bit repetitive, but basically they're pushing the same message. You've got to engage, otherwise yours is the only brain that's developing. Yeah.
I feel there is an overlap between a lot of the units.
Yes.
In terms of curriculum engagement, knowing your students, but it's good.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to be doing.
It is theoretically designed that way, Loretta, so that we're trying to preempt what you'll be dealing with at certain phases of your course and program. So the sorts of issues that you might need to be looking at. And so for that reason, it does seem to have a fair degree of overlap. So it's, it's part of the process. So from the forums this week, forums are pretty quiet, which I understand. I too went away for Easter. This time last year we had Cyclone Debbie, so this one's, at least this Easter's a little bit drier. But Taylor was just wondering, is there a recommended layout that we should use for the 20 slides to ensure we include all the information that's needed? There's been a couple of postings recently on how to include everything. Look, I've written back to Taylor. It is on the forum, but the aim is not to try and include everything. Clearly, the aim is to take control of the topic. And if your topic is engagement, then you look at what engagement does. And engagement, really, there's two kinds of engagements. There's the first E stage engagement, and then there's engagement which turns into motivation throughout the course or throughout the unit of study. So the teacher must keep the student motivated, and that's what we talk about, pedagogical approaches and strategies. That's where they come in handy, and we'll talk a little bit about those tonight. So you really, there's no one answer to this question. It's going to very much depend on your approach, whether you're doing question 8 on literacy or whether you're doing question 3 on engagement and whether you're doing question 4 on Indigenous perspectives. You're going to have to look at your unit of study and you're going to have to identify where that topic comes through in your unit of study. And then you're going to have to tell us how and why you're going to address what you do. So you're pretty much in charge. So if you're wondering about fitting it all in, don't. Engagement, clearly, we're going to look at both the initial stage, the diagnostic stage, where teachers, engagement is all for the teacher. And then we're going to look at motivation, where engagement is for the student. And of course, Gregson goes to, whole school engagement as well, strategy. So we'll talk about some of those tonight as well. So Paula, do I need to draw in? She was talking about the cross-curriculum perspectives, and we know that is one of the assessment criteria. So you are supposed to bring in one of them, but there's only a specification to bring in one. You don't need to bring in more than one. If you're doing a subject, for instance, which lends itself, a topic which lends itself very well to sustainability and Indigenous perspectives, then as I wrote in my answer to Paula, to me that's showing, that's what students do. If you know it, you show it. And that's essentially what assessment's designed to do. So if you stop short at one sustainability priority or Indigenous perspectives or Australia and Asia, a regional perspective, that's fine. There's no penalty for doing that. But if you can draw in another one, you're then engaging and demonstrating what you know and making the connections that, that a higher order thinker can make and does make. Sarah's rethinking her approach. She's doing Year 2 Watch It Grow and exploring the engagement topic. And again, she was wondering how she went about that. Sarah's one of those people who's actually picked up the phone. I do encourage everyone to pick up the phone and give me a call. After tonight, I'll send out a notice saying when I will be sitting in my office, able to take calls, and next week in the non-teaching week. And, hopefully a few people will pick the opportunity and make the most of it. But she's looking at the engagement topic and really is exploring the first E, and then going through and looking at the pedagogical strategies and using Gardner's multiple intelligence model, which as her as her warrant for looking at differentiation, different learning strategies, different assessment strategies, and the need for engagement and motivation. So I think she's come through that and done incredibly well for someone who didn't know where to go late last week, and now has what I think is a really, really viable approach. And she's arguing it well, taking really good control of it. So I'm really looking forward to the result of that one. So fitting it all in, again, just go back to last week, forget past assignments, move into the now with this one. It's a different kind of assignment. You've got 20 slides, 20 by 20, 640 seconds. The whole aim here is to pick a topic, pick a theme, a research topic, one that interests you, pick a unit of study and a year level, and then show us what you know. You don't need to talk about every lesson within the sequence. Just pick out the ones and demonstrate principles of academic and educational theory that are being drawn out by that unit, which is helping connect exemplars of teaching and learning. So forget about past assignments. Don't try and include everything. You are going window shopping. You're going grazing, free ranging across a topic, and you're bringing your educational theory and friends with you, and you're picking bits of that topic out and demonstrating how they connect. That's what your Paishakusha is. At the moment, some people are trying to nail their topic down and realising it's a little bit more slippery than they thought it was. Again, go back to point number 1. Don't try to complete everything. Don't try to include everything. If the topic's slippery, then pick out different units. You may look at where, for instance, collaborative group work is included, and you may then want to bring in, for instance, different perspectives or cross-curriculum perspectives at those particular points and intersections within the unit. You are in control. The important thing is to tell us what you're going to do and then do it, because then we look for it. If you don't tell us what you're going to do, if we're unsure what you're doing, then you can imagine that it can be quite a scary Paishakusha. So commit to your strategy, commit to what interests you, to what unit is relevant to your learners, create the sandpit, jump in, separate content and context. We don't want lots of content. What we want is the context of your understanding. So create a relevant context to discuss parts of a unit, a specific topic, and the classroom strategies and pedagogies that connect to that. By doing this, you diffuse your uncertainty by saying, I'm going to focus on these for these reasons. You can let go of the rest. There's no need to be uncertain about what you're including, because you've told us it's relevant and you've told us why it's relevant and you've justified it at point number 5. You've made us certain, so that we can accept point number 6, that you know what you're doing and that your Paishakusha is a really, really nice 640-second journey of educational theory, pedagogical strategies, a curriculum science focus, okay, all done around a particular theme. So this week, engagement.
Sorry, Colin, can I ask a question?
Please.
I discovered something very interesting in my design technology assessment. It was all about sustainability, and what I did manage to uncover, a lot of the references that I've used there in my investigation there was an overlap between design and science, and I found that fascinating. So I wanted to know ethically, a lot of that information that I have got in that assignment, I want to actually bring in to this assignment. Is that allowed?
Loretta, that's absolutely fine. And look, this is what we were talking about last week about working out who your tribe is, and what tree you sit in. And
Yes.
once you do that as a teacher, you will find the rationale and the theoretical justifications to support your approach.
Yes.
To make you comfortable and also to push you in your practice towards better outcomes. Yeah, so that's entirely supportive and justifiable, and I actually think it's good practice.
Okay, because there is extreme overlaps between design, mathematics, science. And I just found a fabulous topic, and I thought that's exactly what I need for sustainability and bringing in Indigenous perspectives. So
fabulous, and that just indicates to me, Loretta, that the penny's dropping.
The subject is there now, and the whole investigation is being done now. I've got to put it together.
Well done, but definitely go down that path. It's all about identifying your tree. It's all about identifying your tribe and being able to speak from the place you speak as a teacher with confidence and with justification.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Colin. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that because references that I put in here will link to my design assessment.
Well, I'm delighted by that. They should.
Oh, okay. Great. Thank you. Okay.
Good. So a little engagement strategy. I mean, I'm assuming everybody knows these four people. The person on the right is Noam Chomsky, a great linguist. The guy in the middle, it kind of looks Indigenous. Could this be a good way to introduce an Indigenous perspective? Marie Curie, of course, we know, and Albert Einstein, we could never forget. And the guy in the middle, of course, what an interesting way to introduce concept, and this would bring in indigeneity. And David Unayapon, of course, we know as a writer, public speaker, also a scientist and inventor, and Narangiri man. Okay, a very difficult term to pronounce. Had a very basic education, but went on to invent a number of groundbreaking innovations, particularly around shearing sheds and in engineering. He was a really great engineer. And he also a great publisher. He published a book called Native Legends back in 1929 and was a big advocate of improving Indigenous living conditions. So he's not well known, and yet there he is on our $50 note, a scientist, an inventor, an engineer, a very, very bright Indigenous Australian man who can hold his head quite comfortably as a perspective amongst the scientific community. So as teachers, we need to look for our examples. We need to look at opportunities to integrate and bring these perspectives on board, because simply by asking students, very simple question, who would you like to do lunch with? And you have a couple of kids who pick David Unayapon, you can introduce a whole range of topics and a whole range of perspectives within your science course. So we don't have to preach. We don't even have to be experts in these perspectives ourselves. All we need to do is acknowledge alternate and complementary frameworks. That's what we're being asked to do. Our overview for this week. Engagement basically is not simply being focused in class. It's not about having happy hens with their noses down and their tails up. Engagement is, it's got emotional, behavioural and affective domains. And of course we know that. But basically the topic this week tries to introduce that, and it's a topic that's been raised in a range of subjects that you'll be studying. So we're not going to try and cover all of it, but we are going to try and integrate it for science teaching. So it outlines models of teaching that increase student engagement, which we're expected to do. The 5 E's teaching model, or learning sequence, as Bribey prepares to call it in 2015, about looking at ways to engage students. To create an initial point of interaction, a constructivist entering point in the first E, and beyond that, to apply pedagogical and strategic examples to start to engage and motivate the learner to accomplish a whole range of formative and ultimately summative tasks. We should be able to do the following things by the end of this week, and I'm sure most of you are capable of doing them already. The key terms: engagement. The 5 E's is simply a 5-stage teaching model. And again, I repeat, I don't want you to think it's the only inquiry model. The inquiry model actually only has 3 stages. Okay. The initial stage is the diagnostic. The second one is the activity. And the third one is the discussion stage. The 5 E's elaborates that by giving it a top and tail. Okay. The POE has got actually an 8-phase model. Okay, which gives it an elongated top and tail. So, again, the New Zealand model is slightly more elaborate than even Bribey's. But it looks at the student learning, becoming engaged in activity that links their prior knowledge. Key point, links prior knowledge with exploring and then elaborating on the new knowledge about a concept. That's the value of 5Es. That's why it's got that big first E, engagement stage, where students are deeply involved in their learning throughout the unit, but where the teacher actually sits down in a constructivism, socio-cultural constructivism at work, and actually works with the students, with unpacking the students' understanding. Motivation, if you like, is engagement over the long term. It's the drive and willingness. And this is the role of pedagogy. And we'll talk a little bit about that in this session. Engagement has got to work through pedagogy, and assessment has got to be linked to motivation as well. That way we can tell how motivated our learners are, what their outcomes are, what their achievement levels are, and what we may need to do on the run to influence that. Okay, so again, we can look at the engagement over the 5 full E's of the learning cycle. So what we'll cover this week, basically we're going to consider the term engagement, what it really means. It's got 2 real meanings in stage 1 in Brybe's 5E learning sequence. And again, to do this, we'll go back and revisit Matt. Matt was a teacher in one of the early vignettes in inquiry science, I think in week 2 or 3. And he talked about engagement as a diagnostic testing tool, a baseline measurement. And it's a good way of getting inside the learner's head. Once you've done that, of course, you then start to play with their heads and play with their brains. And I mean that in an educational sense, that, you get in there, you work out what the schema is, how it's lying, where the misconceptions and errors are, and then you begin to help them reconstruct. Okay, you go through a reconstruction process through formative tasks, ultimately where you can set them on a co-construction process with peers and with you again, in stages 4 and 5 of the 5Es, where you start to then link them into more advanced collaborative extensions of the science ideas and themes. The second meaning it has is in learner engagement in science education. And of course, this is represented in science pedagogy, in the different tools, techniques and strategies that are used in that pedagogy to keep learners moving along the inquiry cycle. And sometimes Gregson talks about this being a whole school thing. And we know from our research into resilience that, in fact, yes, schools that have a whole school approach to resilience and building learner resilience actually are producing not only more resilient students, but better learners. So there's a strong link there too. So let's have a look at this in practice. From the MOODLE, we met Matt in week 1, and you would know it, the little video like this one. I'll just play it till he comes on the screen, and you can see who he is. Don't know whether you've got any volume there. Do you have volume?
No sound, Colin.
All right, I'll stop it there because I didn't intend to play it through. It is on the MOODLE for you. But Matt is the guy who comes out and talks about his science class, and he doesn't want to waste their time. And he's doing a really simple concept too. It's really good teaching. He's looking at the phases of the moon. So it's a really good one to have a look at. But he's asking these 2 questions. Where are my students starting from? And how can I take this into account when planning my unit of work? Because we all think, okay, we need to start at this particular point. But in reality, disengagement can kick in long before a teacher's ever actually, reached the learning framework of a particular student. And we know that from our brain science. We know that we need to move much more towards project-based learning, where students identify their own projects and their own starting points, so that the teacher can then actually stop trying to do the lowest common denominator to everybody. But Matt talks about measuring learner science understandings, identifying misconceptions, and then finally he talks about deconstructing, stripping down those misconceptions, reconstructing new learner understandings, and then co-constructing new applications. And there, of course, we have the essence of the 5Es model. If you haven't watched it, do get in there, because just watching Matt in action is, actually brings it all to life. And we can't sort of pull a teacher off the shelf and get them to do it, but we can actually look at some really good videos from the Science by Doing folk. The second definition of engagement is creating learning events that go beyond diagnostic investment, so diagnostic assessment. So, and here we're talking about motivation. So primary connections employ, in pedagogies and strategies that interact with learner frameworks at the formative and summative assessment phases of learning also, and you know that from your studies. So anybody doing this engagement topic is going to have to go beyond the first E. You're going to have to look at what engagement looks like, what the pedagogical strategies are in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th stages of that particular model. An assessment needs to be included here, because for science in particular, the process of observation and measurement is continued and embedded. For effective learning, assessment also needs to be a continuous embedded process. So when we look at this, diagnostic, formative and summative are a continuum. Each of those different assessment items play a different role in the learning framework. Okay, they're different cues for the learner's brain. Okay, but they're cues nonetheless. So when a student is going through the diagnostic phase, their learning framework is becoming destabilised because it's starting to falter. It's starting to be broken down in the face of alternate evidence. Formative, okay, they're then starting to jettison bits of that theory. Strategic significance, okay, that doesn't hold up, I'll let that go. Summative, they're starting to look for common threads. Okay, if this is true in A and B, then chances are it's true in C. So they start to apply it to new applications and new situations. So assessment is the beginning, middle and end parts of the 5 E's. It's also the beginning, middle and end parts of engagement. And there's a big focus in the ACS on teachers to come up with assessment that is actually a little bit more dynamic and a little bit varied. So Matt gets in there with his socio-cultural constructivism. And if one accepts that learning is the process of constructing understandings from experience, then it's really important that we treat our students with respect, that we begin from that position and have a look at their ideas. And a lot of them have got really good ideas, strong ideas. Some of them are children who come from faith communities. And many of the misconceptions they have come from common language, have come from common shared frameworks, cultural frameworks. You know, the whole notion that the sun rises in the morning. What a misconception. Of course, the sun doesn't rise at all. Copernicus fixed that, centuries ago. The sun does not rise. It is actually the earth that turns. Okay, so, we've got really interesting perceptions here. And our language perpetuates this. Others are based on direct experience. For a student who observes the sun, okay, it's reasonable to come to the conclusion the sun's around revolves the earth, and Ptolemy did this centuries ago. But this whole notion of sorting real understandings from book understandings, and Matt points out it requires diagnosis. We've got to get away from students faking good, and we've got to get the real answers to the real questions. And so the purpose of the first E, the first engagement, is for the learner to actually constructively engage with the teacher. Make sure with the teacher, and the teacher is guiding that process. So the first E is essentially diagnostic for the teacher's benefit. So make sure that comes across in your discussions. Any comments on that before we move along? People clear on that the first E is very much teacher-driven, teacher-centric? And of course, the remaining E's are too when we think about it, because once we get students, we start to mobilise their learning frameworks, it's a question of pulling them along that constructivist highway, isn't it? Of actually saying to them, well, let's deconstruct this. Okay, now let's reconstruct, along the lines of what evidence suggests it should look like. And look, then let's co-construct that in a way that's going to help you make your way through the world and interpret things in a more socially and cognitively useful way. So formative assessment is stages 2 and 3 of Bybie's model, and it's essentially for the student. This is where the student is now starting to move into their world. As Piaget said in 1962, make a scientist of the child. The child is now starting to become a scientist because it's starting to question those assumptions, and those assumptions are guided assumptions. The questioning is a guided process. So we give them feedback. It's like feeding chickens. And you'll see this in some of your units of study. So when you're commenting about engagement, how important is the formative assessment process to learner engagement? And therefore, how important is that original diagnosis? Because if a teacher gets it wrong, or if a teacher's just off teaching what they want to teach and the students are doing something else, then we've got disengagement and we've got dysfunction. So the idea behind formative assessment is that feedback is going to feed the changes and the construction of students' final deep understandings. And that the whole term, formative, captures the sense that assessment is going to provide information to an evolving mind. Okay, we know that, and the brain is constantly responding to stimulus. We know this. So it's not a matter of saying, okay, A plus B equals C, and that's a fact. Okay, you've actually got to show it. You've got to demonstrate. You've got to actually do it. Back to the Confucian principles, I do and I understand. While sometimes detailed feedback's important, students benefit from brief and continuous feedback, formative. And it's also good because a teacher may think they've understood a misconception. And look, when I visit students in schools, I get this all the time. My first 2 lessons this week went brilliantly, but then I seemed to hit a wall. Why? Because the teacher then starts thinking about what they want to teach, rather than where the learner is. So it's really important that formative feedback to become very skilled at formative feedback in this process to maintain engagement, because the minute a student starts to experience failure, they start to disengage. Learning can be broken down into small steps, okay, with an assessment dimension. Each step can be assessed, and that assessment can actually be fun. There's a whole range of tasks, that you can do that are actually fun in terms of assessment, and we'll get a chance to talk about those later in the course. Summative assessment, Bribey moves on to stages 4 and 5. And these are good stages. And then clearly, stage 4 usually is associated with the science inquiry skills stage. So if a student has a concept, and that concept has been a misconcept, and then the teacher's taught some new science and built some inquiry and some process around it, the student now has to be equipped with the skills, with the inquiry skills at stage 4, to go out and apply those scientific principles to a new situation and see whether that knowledge, that science knowledge, holds up under tension. And so this is the whole purpose of stage 4. And again, the focus and the pressure on the teacher is to design something that is connected to assessment, that can be assessed. Because without that assessment component, how does the teacher know that that the students are doing little more than just having fun, science fun? So summative assessment usually occurs at stage 5 towards the end of the unit. Essentially, as the name says, it's a summary of how well the student has learnt. The information is often converted to a grade. That's our system. It's a high-stakes system, and the grades are still important and reported to the education publics. And it's commonly associated with pen and paper tests. Unfortunately, that's changing, fortunately that's changing. We're moving towards models. We're moving towards labs. We're moving towards science fairs. We're moving towards conferences and conference presentations. A lot of science teachers are actually adopting interviews. We'll move on and have a look at some of the techniques shortly. 2 key principles with assessment. And I raise assessment because just in case you have a blind spot, if you're doing the engagement topic, don't think that it doesn't, lapse out to assessment. In your discussion of engagement, you're going to have to connect that also. What is one of the big pedagogies? What is the strategy of a teacher? Is to assess either diagnostically, formatively, or summatively. So it's going to have to appear in your engagement discussion. You can't simply say it's simply about having eyes on me, 1, 2, 3. That's not engagement, that's compliance. Engagement happens at a much lower level in a learner. So the 2 key principles, less assessment, but more detailed assessment, okay? Quality items. The second principle is a variety of items. And again, here you can bring in your Indigenous perspective. Okay, clearly, when we open science up culturally, we open learning up culturally. So there needs to be a variety of techniques that a teacher can be confident the student can understand with science ideas. Pretty much preaching to the converter, I imagine. So I won't talk too long about these things, but there are a range of strategies you'll come across in your units of study, particularly in your primary connections units. You'll see some are using interviews, a bit of concept mapping. Different teachers use concept maps at either stage. And again, if you're getting concept maps appearing in your unit, think about what stage it's appearing at. Okay, what the teacher's trying to do, re-engage with their learner around the learning. Notebooking, we can see, is very diagnostic, a little old-fashioned. But let's face it, not many scientists don't carry a notebook. It's a really simple warrant to put on a student. Rubrics, you can see formative and assessment. Now, if you're going to use rubric-based assessment, you actually have to talk to students about the rubrics and what they mean. So they have to understand, they have to be able to imagine what they're being assessed on. Once they can understand what they're doing with a rubric, they can then imagine themselves being part of that rubric. Portfolios at the top. Okay, a very good one again. A lot of science schools are moving towards portfolios. It'll be essentially a STEM portfolio, but it will have its science, maths, engineering, technology components. Student reporting, formative, summative. Okay, where they're getting up doing presentations, they're doing seminars. It's a conference, a global, a mock global warming conference where students are bringing their perspectives. All kinds of things happen at that level, formative and summative, but rarely diagnostic. A self-assessment, okay, where they sit down and write a report on their learning, formative and summative, and of course a peer review. Again, to use peer reviews, you're going to have to train your learners. So somewhere in the unit, If they're adopting a peer review process, for it to be valid, the learners are going to have to be inducted and taught how to do this kind of engagement, and how to make that engagement count as learning. So there's a range of things to look for when you go through your unit, and you don't have to cover them all. In your PACE-CULTURAL, you may pick out, for instance, some assessment strategies and talk about how they connect to engagement. You may pick up some socio-cultural perspectives, like an Indigenous perspective or a sustainability perspective or an Asian perspective, and talk about how that builds engagement in the unit. You are free to nominate, but clearly your topic is engagement and your focus is pedagogical and teaching strategies. So assessment is a big part of that, so don't turn a blind eye to it.
Colin?
Yes?
Sorry, just looking at that slide, you mentioned earlier more leaning towards project work, project-based learning.
Yes.
Would that fall under portfolios?
It would, as some schools are doing it that way, where the student at the end of the year or end of term has to complete a portfolio, and in that portfolio there'll be a description of items they have to include, including one science investigation. It may be a STEM portfolio, for instance, where they're producing a product or they're actually testing water quality, or they're doing something along those lines. But there must be one science investigation in there. There must be one engineered solution, for instance. There must be some evidence of mathematical calculations and problem solving. So they're given a list of things they must include in that portfolio, and the teacher interviews them regularly to see how they're going on those tasks, so that by the end of the term, they have a portfolio that represents specific subject content in an integrated portfolio of assessment.
Okay. So if they were working, if it's lower classes, if they were working with projects, would that still fall within portfolio, formative and summative?
Definitely could do. You could argue that it did. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And Loretta, would you like to explain that to others, just in case other people don't know what projects is?
Basically what I've done is worked on a particular unit, and then I created a project for the whole class, and had them investigating certain elements within that project, but they had to have their own project book and then detail their learning journey in that project book.
Fabulous. That's a really good description of essentially what teachers do and what happens.
And then I could go to that book and then actually assess where they are, where their thinking is, because a lot of their thinking would be detailed within their writings within that book. And then I would understand where they are in terms of, in the unit, whether I had to go back and reassess and then relook at doing certain elements of the unit with the students.
Fabulous, Loretta. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. And I hope everyone else is able to understand what we're moving when we talk about project-based learning, moving towards that sort of model, and just the deep engagement and the deep opportunities that gives a teacher to engage with learner frameworks. And speaking of elements of engagement, Gregson figure 5.2 talks about behavioural, emotional and cognitive. And we know that there's different facts. You can't control what happens for a student in their life. We know that the most influential outcome for a student in terms of academic success is actually what happens in the home. The teacher is number 2. So even when it comes to teaching, we're not the most important. We're only second on a list of things. And beyond that, of course, we've got behavioural, emotional and cognitive features also that kick in and affect learner engagement. So, and the reality is not every kid every day is going to feel on top of it. And part of being a good engager of learners is actually also knowing when to ease back and when to regroup. And I'm sure you've had this on prac. You've gone in sometimes after lunch on a Thursday or Friday, and it's been really difficult to get any learning focus at all. And one of the best things you can do is actually learn how to disengage or break up or transition is the new term we use, students from situation to situation. There's a whole science of pedagogy of transition now, believe it or not, related to the pedagogy of interiority, where we start to try and slow our students down and make them more mindful. And we also give cues and learning rituals to enhance that, so that we transition the students from one state of being into another where their brain, their cognition, their emotions and their behaviours are more receptive to the learning that we want them to engage in. So Gregson talks a little bit about this, but not much. Bear in mind it will come up in other subjects, but essentially the pedagogy of transition is a growing area, particularly in Queensland schooling with the changes in years 6 and 7. So it's certainly a growing area. Gregson also talks about small e and big E. And the big E engagement is the whole, the socio-cultural perspective. School is for me, education's a resource now and the future. I'm a bright kid, I probably always will be. Whereas the small E engagement is about students who are involved in active participation, which is better behaviour, genuine valuing, positive emotions around schooling, reflective involvement and deep understanding and expertise, and cognition, at least some of the time. Martin Haberman, a great philosopher and educationalist, identified back in 1996 and is still often quoted as the benchmark or the bar of engagement when students are involved in issues they regard as vital concerns. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Students think they're vital concerns. They're being helped to see major concepts, big ideas and general principles, not simply isolated facts. Now, look, this is coming through the Australian curriculum now, but Haberman was practicing this and introducing this in Germany back in the 1990s. It was happening in other countries, involved in planning what they are doing. So, portfolio assessment. How do I want to be assessed? Well, I want to be assessed on my strengths, not on my weaknesses. What are my strengths? Well, here's a portfolio that represents what I do best. Assess me on this. Measure my social opportunities and my social future on my strengths, not on my weaknesses. And I think that's a fair request from a learner. And Haberman also talks about learners being involved in applying ideals such as fairness, equity and justice to their world. Now, Dennis Goodrum would be a big supporter of this as well. And if we can get these sorts of agendas going in our classrooms, in our science inquiry approaches, then we're well on our way to those, those big E engagements. Where we're teaching students, the power of citizenship in the Aristotelian sense, often as citizens, we feel like we're just ripped off, we're just cash cows, we're just tax cows, we're a whole, but Aristotle actually had a different view of the citizen, that they were political, they were active, they were engaged, they were big E people, not small e people. And, we've got to question our education system. It promotes small e, cooperation, compliance, okay, at the risk of or the fear of creating a citizenry based with big E expectations and pushing for a world, a more sellable world. I introduced you in the session to the work of Philip Schletke, and he's brilliant. He's not that well known here in Australia, but he did a lot of work on engagement and came up with this. It was a meta study, believe it or not, done over a couple of different generations. And he showed there are basically 5 responses from students to schooling: engagement, strategic compliance, which is one of the biggest, ritual compliance, one of the biggest groups, retreatism, slightly smaller than ritual compliance, and rebellion. Engagement and rebellion, this was a bell curve. At the top end was engagement, very few students actually engaged. At the bottom end was rebellion, very few actually rebelled. But those who engaged, fully engaged; those who rebelled, fully rebelled. So it was a really interesting psychological concept that Schletke came up with. And as you can see there, engagement, high attention and commitment to the tasks at hand. Rebellion, attention is diverted. Now, this work was picked up in 1991 by a Frenchman called Etienne Wenger, and he was a French-Canadian. And he did his PhD on the postal service. And we all, at that stage, the research world, the education world was all focusing on good learners. But Wenger did something brilliant. He flipped the classroom and he started to focus on disengaged learners. And he identified for everything that the research pointed out a good learner can do, he identified a non-learner or rebellious learner could do. So he came up with identities of non-participation. And he also came up with identities of participation. And he showed that it is intellectually, cognitively, emotionally, and behaviourally just as demanding to be a rebel, to be non-compliant, as it is to be highly engaged. He said you have to come up with just as many strategies. You have to be just as clever. Unfortunately, you've got a shorter lifespan because the system will spit you out. But ultimately, Schletke's work was really quite informative, and it opened up this whole consideration of disengagement. What can we do to minimise the risk to disengagement? And he came up with his profile, of course. Here's what engaged students can do: create, evaluate, analyse, apply, understand, remember. The ritually compliant in the middle: create, evaluate, analyse, apply, understand, and short term, they'll recall it, but the amygdala will kick in, they'll dump it because it doesn't really matter. And the rebels will, obviously they'll take in little. They'll have negative attitudes about what they've taken in, and they'll disrupt anybody who tends to agree with their view of the world. So we can see that Schletke's, while it's fairly common sense, these prototypes or these archetypes of Schletke's held up beautifully under research. And again, he's gone on to teach us, along with Wenger, a lot about disengagement, about what the rebel and retreatist groups do, about the wasted energy and time in the ritually compliant. We've got a group of kids here, your C minuses, C pluses, who really would be capable in a different system with different design and different learning outcomes, of much higher outcomes. Kids are strategically compliant. We can look here and at the waste of opportunity and innovation. They recall, they remember, but they don't actually innovate. Okay, we're not seeing here any real application of innovation and the sorts of things that our whole STEM agenda currently wants. Australia to become a new economic entity, and it's going to require people to think differently and study differently. Factors affecting engagement, figure 5.3, as Gregson does, they take really complex concepts and put them in little tables and diagrams. Please, go into the background behind those, because they say a lot more, I think, than towards your assessment, what you need to do in your PACE-CULTURAL than a simple table will. But we know that the student has got things that are going on for them in their world. The teacher, the whole school. We know that there are schools in Brisbane where teachers can't, they can't find teachers. Here in Townsville, we're importing teachers from New Zealand to work in some schools because local teachers won't do it. Parents, we know the family is the key contributor to academic success, and yet almost 1 in 2 families these days are disintegrating under social pressures and creating all sorts of challenges for kids in homes. And of course, the community. It was, let me think, trying to think back to 1980s when my 2 nephews were going to school in Geelong, and I rocked along to their school to visit them one time at lunchtime and bought a birthday cake. And I rolled up to the school, and it was Corio Primary School, brought to you by Ford Motor Company Australia. So down in Geelong in Victoria, the local industries were actually sponsoring schools. Back in the 1980s, of course, it's Ford Motor Company has now left Geelong, so it's no longer the sponsor. And the school is without a sponsor, and it's struggling financially to get resources for its students. So factors affecting engagement, we can see that the whole school model does have some application to our real world. And engagement strategies, coming back to our assessment task. What can we do? When you're looking at your unit and you're talking, if you're doing that engagement strategy, question, what's happening in that unit that you can target and use as evidence? And here are some of the things, help students make a personal connection to the lesson. And there's a couple of strategies there. And some cultural inclusivity there. Present a slideshow, get students to create their own PowerPoint summarising the key points of a lesson. So, you flip the classroom, they become co-teachers. Very much a co-constructivist model. Invite guest speakers into your class, so you broaden the classroom. Use a variety of media, newspapers, cartoons, magazines. Now, Science by Doing stress this a lot. Display a statement on the board. Immediately play a video that supports the statement. Okay, draw out a response. Bring emotion into your framework, and surprise the students with theatre. Theatre techniques to stage a reenactment. Wear a costume. When I used to teach, I used to have a box of hats, and I'd pluck out different hats for different perspectives and different occasions. And of course, it lent itself beautifully to flipping the students into problem solvers using de Bono. So think about what you're going to do with engagement strategies. Look in your unit, see what's recommended. And in the PACE-CULTURAL, demonstrate your understanding of engagement by bringing those to the surface for everybody to see. The brain just keeps popping up in this unit, and so it should, because it doesn't just function as an audio or visual tape recorder. We stressed that last week. All information is being processed. The brain is constantly asking questions. And the first thing it says is, have I heard or seen this information before? Conception, misconception. Where does it fit in? Schema. Right schema, wrong schema, what can I do with it? Okay, can I assume that this is the same idea I had yesterday or last month? All these questions the brain is rapid firing and dealing with constantly. And active classrooms, the whole focus here of an engaged, active classroom, an inquiry-driven classroom, gives opportunities for the information to be better processed. And just going back to last week, we've got 4 stages of learning: acquisition, collecting, rehearsal, processing, retention, keeping, retrieval, using. And we can see that coming through the 5 E's. Levels of memory, we get aware of a stimulus. We may remember a smell. Sometimes, for instance, when I smell people having toast in the morning, I think of childhood, and that was many, many years ago. It's an awareness of stimulus. Immediate, okay? It can take acquisition, seconds to minutes. Working, for us to file it away so we can actually use it can take minutes to hours, and rehearsal is involved in that. Long-term retention, hours to a lifetime. And so often, particularly when you get together at parties with old friends, you realise that people get their memories wrong. So what they retain is in fact not entirely correct. It's all the stuff of legend. The teenage brain, we've got to talk about emotions. We've got to bring that in here. And the amygdala and the teenage brain. Any information travels first to the amygdala, which is our garbage box. It's our sifting box. It's that little mushroom-shaped image you can see there on the left. It basically is a sifter. It's a crap detector. So if a kid's in a bad space emotionally, no matter what you tell them, it's not going to go in. It's a visual cognitive barrier to learning. And in the teenage brain, the amygdala is developing faster than the frontal lobe. So we're going to get constant reactive, overreactive kids, and particularly amongst boys, because the frontal lobe develops more slowly than that in girls. So in the teenage brain, the amygdala is developing faster. Boys are very reactive. They're not reflective. They're high risk takers. It's during adolescence they do things no one else wants to do, and the way they compensate for that is by failing with dignity. Or I don't care. And yet we know in fact at a tender learning age that's a pretty bad fail when they're not caring already. And we provide positive supports for a positive emotional development for learning. And safe and how we deal with the emotional side. Resilience, teaching for resilience, problem solving, inquiry. All of these things are positive supports for positive emotional development for learning. And of course, it leads to an owner-driven, a self-driven environment. Barriers to engagement, they're there. Okay, if you have a close look at it. And one of the questions does in fact ask you to consider barriers to engagement. And we know cultural barriers are one. We've talked about that, and that might fit into point number 2 there. But that, Gregson goes through and identifies them. Science given a low priority, 30 to 60 minutes per week. Oh, wait a minute, if it's a sports day or an assembly, no science for 2 weeks. It's not being taught with relevance. There's no context and too much content. So kids are just, seeing science as numbers and words. Not enough experiments, not enough hands-on, too much content. Some teachers and parents think it's too hard. Believe it or not, that does exist. Hence, we're seeing decreasing rates of engagement in primary school science. They created STEM to try and arrest that flow. But I would defy any of you at this point in time to identify the engineering curriculum in a primary school. It just doesn't exist. So I don't know how they're going to reduce the exodus from sciences using STEM, because it actually has no real application in a primary school scenario. And what's more, research shows teachers don't even understand what STEM is. And there's too much writing. A push for multiliteracy, for art, for poetry, song. Why not have a sit-in and a peace rally where people write songs against global warming rather than actually present little posters that were done by the students the year before? All kinds of strategies we could look at. Links to assessment. When you're looking at your primary connections unit, okay, include how to enhance engagement. And assessment should really be enhancing engagement. So when you're looking at your unit and talking about connections to assessment, connections to better learning, look for examples where students are asked to state the information in their own words. Partner discussions where they're put together with partners. Response cards, panels and fish bowls, put in teams to do either in science inquiry or investigations. Think of an application, okay, where they're prompted to actually think about how this may happen in the real world. Go and research it, explain it. See connections between it and other ideas. Have open discussions, polling, recall prior material, flow charts, a whole range of examples there. Whip-arounds are beauties. Celebrity heads. Okay, propose a test. Get students to write their own tests. Fabulous assessment. You'll find it's potentially a lot more difficult than you would do it. But these are some of the strategies we can use to enhance engagement. And if you're doing this topic in your PACE-CULTURAL, or even if you're looking at other topics, look in your unit for these examples, because these are things that are shown and known to be pedagogical techniques and teaching strategies that actually create engagement. Now, at that note, I'm going to stop right there. And the first thing I'll do is make mention of the assessment criteria, what I went back to last week. It is one of the required statements that you do reference your material. Your PACE-CULTURAL is an opportunity for you to take control of a topic and basically write your own response. But we don't want to see you doing your own response. What we want to see is you using supporting evidence to justify your response. So it's really important that you do have supporting evidence when you back your analysis. So I made the analogy last week about facing the Hells Angels in a sleazy downtown bar. Don't go on your own. Bring your gang of friends. And your gang of friends are, in fact, the tree, the group, the tribe, the perspectives that you are bringing to your PACE-CULTURAL. Now, I'm going to pause there and open the floor for any questions. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? Comment they'd like to make?
Colin, it's Maxine. I have a question. I just got your email because I was in another lesson. So I just want to ask a question. So do I actually state the research topic I'm going to do in my introduction?
Look, if I had 50 marks on the line, I would.
Okay, so I've actually got to state which topic because... Okay, yeah, so I've just got to change. Okay, thank you.
Come out, be explicit. I mean, look, I think mystery is, it's quite sexy, actually. I'm a fan of mystery, but not as a marker.
Okay.
I really want to know what it is you're going to grapple with here and what you're throwing your extreme energy into, and how you're going to do it. And I want to know that early so that I can say, gee, Maxine, you set that up really, really well. At every point, I was with you. You said you were going to do it, you did it. Every step you took, you provided evidence and support for. So, all I can do is stand back and clap. Here's my feedback.
Okay.
Yeah.
State the topic. Okay.
State the topic. Be explicit. In the same way that you would teach something, do your assessment in that same model.
Okay. Thank you, Colin.
No, it's a presentation. I'll just come out and say to everyone again, it is a presentation. And with a presentation, it's not celebrity presentations where you want people to guess what you're talking about. You actually want them to know from the outset, this is what I'm talking about and this is what I'm going to say. Here are my main points. Here's my supporting evidence. Now let's start and go, be explicit. It's a really good point, Maxine. I appreciate you raising it, because I do still think there's misunderstanding out there that, because you're not the only one. I've had a couple of emails today around that same theme. Yeah, so good on you. Thank you. Any other questions about assessment at this stage?
Colin, the reference page is the last page. That's not within the 20 slides.
It's not on the 20 slides at all. You can go to 2 or 3 pages. Reference your images, by all means, unless you're producing your own. But feel free to reference all your images, all your resources, and you can take as many slides as you choose.
Okay, so if my PowerPoint is 24 pages, that's okay. But
four of those are references. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah. And look, just clarifying the due date, I had an email from Brenda Wan, indicating that some of her students were a little confused because on the documents it says week 6. On the course profile it actually says the non-teaching week. April 12th is the deadline. Just to clarify, I'll send out a notice tonight telling everybody it will in fact be the following week. It will be week 6. I will accept that that's a little bit vague, and that we'll make a uniform due date for week 6 for the 19th of April. So just to clarify that for everybody, there it is in the public domain. And I do apologise if there was any confusion. It did write down the 12th, but some people haven't seen that. So I'm not going to penalise or stress anybody unnecessarily. So the 19th will become the due date. Okay, or the official due date. Any other questions?
Colin, I have another question. It's Maxine again. As there is so much context put, that's something that I'm really struggling, trying to not put so much words in, content in. Can I put some tables on the slide? Or is that not am I not allowed to do that?
Maxine, it's a presentation. So if you think a table is going to represent a concept really, really well, do it.
Okay.
This is totally your control. Sometimes you'll have reflective pictures, you know, maybe of children doing tasks when you want to look at, you may be doing engagement, for instance. What does engagement look, smell and feel like? Well, here's an idea. You get a kinesthetic sense of it or visual sense of it. But then you may have some data you want to present, and a table would visually be, you know, much better to do that. And you can also save yourself a lot of words. Just say, look, I draw attention here to, you know, to the third column in particular, row number 3, and once, you know, look at the trends there, and or look at the information contained there. So you can actually save 1,000 words by having an image.
Oh, okay, that's good, because like there's a few slides that I wanted to put tables on because it saves so much words, and I was like, oh, it would be really good if I could do it, but I just wasn't sure if I could do it. So that's really good. It
is, Maxine. And as long as you're justifying it and your approach justifies it, you can do it. If it looks odd, clearly your marker will pull up and say, what's this? But if it's in the context and you set up a context and it's part of your contextual story, it's well done.
Thank you, Colin.
Good. Any other questions or comments? Some good ones coming out tonight. Thank you so much. Everyone else content? All right, please. Now, what I'll do tonight when I get offline is I'll publish this to YouTube and then put the link online. And then I'll send out a notice to everyone indicating the times when I'll be sitting by my phone in my office next week, and would welcome your calls, please. We don't have any official office hours being a distance course, but I'm going to give some in the hope that people will feel more able to pick up the phone and call me during those times. So I do invite your calls. I do welcome them and would rather talk to you about issues than worry about you not talking to anyone at all. So please do that. Get busy in the forums because we are entering the pointy end of this assessment item. Before we start to move into STEM and ways of working scientifically, and then we finish the course. The last couple of weeks are pretty much content-oriented, where we start to look at the biological and the space and earth sciences. They're massive fields. So all we can do is limit ourselves to patterns of inquiry, but we'll see what we can do around that and hopefully do as much interesting things as we possibly can. Thank you all for sharing your Wednesday night. I know that you've got places you'd rather be and things you'd rather be doing, but trust me, when you're sitting in a science classroom with your students, you'll think back and you'll actually say, I'm glad I know how to teach science, because there's a lot of teachers out there who feel fairly uncomfortable with the whole process, and, you know, do science justice, because it really is a fascinating field. Take care of yourselves, and thank you again for your time tonight. Good night.